Well, it was built in 1939 for Frederick and Harriet Rauh. He had an insurance company at the time. He was a real innovator in insurance. And a developer got a hold of it after the second family sold it in the late 80s. He divided the 8.5 acres up into 5 lots and planned to tear the house down. The roof fell in. It sat here empty for years. And we put it up on Preservation 911 for the trust, and we started getting some articles about it and a little bit of attention that this modernist early house was going. And some neighbors saw it, fell in love with it, and they figured out who used to live here. And it was Emily Rauh Pulitzer. It was her childhood home. And they put a package together, let's save your house, and FedEx it to her. And believe it or not, when they got home that day, there was a phone call from Emily saying, let's do this. Let's save the house.
I'm Emily Rauh Pulitzer. We're in St. Louis at the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts. When my brother and I left home, our parents sold the house to another family who had, I think, 6 children who grew up there. And when they left home, the parents moved to a smaller place and they sold it. Unfortunately, I suspect it was fairly close to the top of the market, and the man who bought it had no development experience at all, was able to get loans and bought the property with the idea of turning it into a subdivision.
It had stucco on the outside of it. That was one of the biggest challenges. They put drive it on and they glued it on with Portland cement. So when we tried to take it off, it destroyed the cinder block. And what turned out to be the best way to do it was a guy with a really sharp chisel when it's really cold outside. So over a couple of winters, we had people out here just chipping it off. And in some places, we actually lost the block. And we had to make new cinder block. And we couldn't find anything that had the right character and the right porosity and just look. And finally, it was one of those things where our mason was in the cinder company's office, and the old retired president was there. And he said, we used to get the cinders from Indianapolis Power and Light. We can shut down the plant, and we'll make you some. And so they did. And then we chemically analyzed the exterior, and it was lime whitewash, and that's what that is. So we're getting back to its 1939 look.
I had heard that this man wanted to turn the property into a subdivision, that he had been ransacking the woods and just leaving these big, gorgeous trees. I mean, not even using the timber. And I thought the house was down. I thought that it was over. At one point, I had read that there was a real estate agent in Cincinnati who dealt in modern houses, and I got in touch with her, and she'd never had heard of the house, and then I never heard any more. And that was a couple of years before I got a letter from a couple saying they passed the house every day. They were terribly distressed at the condition, that it was being vandalized, and they would like to buy it, but they couldn't get a mortgage. I said I would go to Cincinnati and meet with them, and we formed a kind of team, and I said to my brother, if you handle the business end, I'll put up the money. And they have been the watchdogs, and they have videotaped and photographed all along the destruction period and the early construction period. And it was clear that this was a bigger project than any of us had realized. And I must say that's true with every building project.
The house had lost most of its material, and the first phase of fixing it was people in white suits and respirators getting a foot of mold out of it. So we just put this parquet floor down yesterday. We're at a really exciting part where it's all coming together. That media cabinet is original. We restored it. All the laminations had been crinkled. So stereo equipment from 1939. And this is the original hardware. We have a little bit of it, but we're remaking everything we don't have. That stone's new, and we have photographs of this. It was for publication.
This is stone, not concrete?
That's stone, and then we have slate down below. So this will all be finished in a very dark, almost walnut shade. And then we put geothermal heating and cooling in, and these are all fan coil units. But they had radiators there, and so we remade all the radiator cases. They're upstairs to match exactly. These are all Hope's windows in the exact same opening proportion as original, except it's insulated now. John Becker, the architect, bragged about everything was built in, you know, no need for additional furniture. The house was a machine, and so we're remaking all the built-ins. It's a deceiving house, too. It looks really simple, but it's also very sophisticated and complex.
The destruction of the woods is sadder than the destruction of the house, because we've been able to bring the house back pretty much to what it was. And although we're regrading and planting trees and getting rid of invasive plants and planting, we've taken up some of the wildflowers and are going to replant them. Never in my lifetime will it be the same. And I think that has been the thing that's been the saddest, as you can see, to both my brother and to myself.
The landscape was designed by A.D. Taylor, who designed the Pentagon landscape. He was very involved in sending landscape architects out during the WPA. He was in Washington. He created the Bible of landscape problems of the American forest, which they used for about 15 years. Did many drawings of those little camp stoves, you know, the mountaintop shelters. But here he designed a forested landscape for these people with a wildflower walk, and we're restoring all of that. Matter of fact, we took hundreds of wildflowers out last year so that we could eradicate the invasives and then put them back. They've been in a nursery all winter. And there are lots of trees. We have hundreds and hundreds of trees coming. And Emily told us her father took her on a walk, on the wildflower walk, every morning before school.
We have done what we've done despite having no plans. And this has been really tough and, you know, another sadness. And it seems that the Albers, who bought the house from my parents, had left the landscape plans in the house, and of course they were gone. It's been wonderful. My brother and sister-in-law and I have all met with the architects and Paul and the landscape architect, talking about our memories of what was where, what was in the garden, where the garden was, because the land was so badly damaged that it was sometimes very hard to recognize different areas around the house. And happily, we each had different memories to some extent, which then came together as a bigger picture. So that part has been really nice.
What do you remember about the house? When
Well,
did you leave it?
I was born in 36 and the house was built in 38, so I don't remember much about its construction. A couple of my strenuous recollections are, where are my neighbor kids? Where are some buddies? I went to school. The community that the house was in did not have a school, so I went to school about 3 miles away. The community's Wyoming, which is a suburb of Cincinnati, and well, the house was different from the houses that my friends had.
Did you feel self-conscious about
Yes, absolutely.
What kind of houses did they have?
Well, very nice, traditional, I'd say upper middle class, nice homes. But, you know, nobody had a home that looked like that or was that big. So there was embarrassment there.
It was clearly unique, and kids don't like to be different. And so it was often uncomfortable. And one of the extraordinary rewards of doing this is having been in touch with some of my childhood friends and hearing their happy, positive, excited memories about being in the house. And so we're planning a party in which we will invite everyone who was in the house when we lived there who were still alive. And I think that'll be fun. And lots of people came through the house to look at it. And, sort of tours. Could we come and see your house? And this, always described to me as a little old lady who probably wasn't as old as I am, said to Mother after going through the house, "Why, it doesn't look the least bit like a gasoline station." So that was the word that was going around. I loved the experience of being there. I loved the big windows. I loved being, waking up in the morning and making pictures out of the limbs of the trees that I could see from my window. It had an enormous impact on my life. And when I went to college, I took an art history course because my parents had some contemporary paintings and sculpture, and people in those days were not as cool as they are now, and they would say, "Well, what does that mean?" And I had been trying to respond, and I thought, well, I ought to take an art history course and learn something about it, and that set me on the route to my profession as an art museum curator.
I discovered some really interesting things through this process of restoration, which I never knew. Probably the first most shocking thing was seeing the mules grading the driveway. And you realize now when this property was built and what was available at that time. And then the second thing that was really eye-opening was realizing how old my father was and mother when they built this house. My father was 32 and my mom was 27. And I relate that to me at 32. And what a gutsy move. They moved away from all of their friends. Out, Woodlawn, Ohio was out. I mean, it was a good half an hour to downtown Cincinnati. It was all rural farm area. And then they built a house that was so different from everything else that was around it. And what a gutsy move. My father, because of his father's early death, was also running the family business. So he had a lot on his plate.
In later life, our mother was always the more venturesome one in terms of contemporary art. But she told me that Dad was the leader. And I think they loved this property. And when John Becker said to them, "Do you want to have big windows?" They said yes. When he said, "Do you mind having a flat roof?" Unfortunately, they said yes, because it always leaked. But I think they kind of backed into it. And because he was a friend, and because they were excited by this whole project, they built something that was totally different than anything they knew.
Our board president, Chuck Schroer, is probably one of the leading real estate attorneys in town. And when Emily Pulitzer decided to try and save her family house, she sought out a lawyer and ended up with Chuck Schroer. And she told him at one point, "And we're also going to want to restore this house and then give it to a preservation organization." And he said, "I have the group." He said, "I'm the board president of Cincinnati Preservation Association." So we worked out the terms of the gift and started the restoration process about two and a half years ago. And we've been very methodical about it. We brought in really high-level materials conservation laboratories and analyzed all the parts and pieces. We have really good photographic evidence of what was there from 1939 pre-publication photographs of the house. And then we have her memory and her brother's memory, and we walk them through and ask what was here. And so we've been piecing it back together that way.
There was one other really extraordinary thing that happened. Before I got the letter from Gina and Gary Anapple, I think it was the year before, it was winter, and I had gotten a catalog from the Wright auction house in Chicago. And I didn't normally receive their catalogs. And it sat around for a while. And then one evening I was haphazardly looking through the catalog, which had large, glossy, colored photographs, but it also had a photograph about an inch square, and the entry said John Becker. And I thought, how many John Beckers can there be? And I looked at this little black and white photograph, and it was the fire screen and andirons from the house. And I thought, well, I'm going to get those. And I got in touch with a dealer in Chicago who bid on them for me and got them for me. The fire screen and andirons will go back to the house for when it reopens, but they will belong to the Cincinnati Art Museum because, you know, they're design objects that I think have real distinction on their own. You know, I believe in preservation from a professional point of view. I think great architecture of any period is so important. I think of the joy I get being every day in this building by Tadao Ando. Every day the experience is different. And there is so much bad building going on that to destroy anything that is good of any period is just a tragedy. Everybody is passionate and sentimental about the house they grew up in.